Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens, and if I seem in unusually high spirits tonight, it is because at long last we are beginning our unit on Professor J.R.R. Tolkien's posthumous and incomparable work of mythology and history, the Silmarillion. This is something that I've been looking forward to for a very long time, and I'm very excited to finally set our feet to this long and winding road. In this abbreviated introductory session, I'm going to sketch the history of the book and basically frame out what our approach is going to be to this complex and fascinating and challenging and infinitely rewarding volume. Next week, we're going to jump into the very deepest waters. We're going to plunge deep into the entirety of the Ainulindalë, the Elven creation myth. But this week, I wanted a gentle introduction. I wanted to talk a little about what the Silmarillion is, about how it came into being, both its creative process under the pen of the professor himself, and then through the editorial work and further creative endeavor, too, of his son, Christopher Tolkien, too. I want to talk about how the book comes into being. I want to talk about how we ought to approach it. And I want to conclude with some thoughts on the purpose of Tolkien's legendarium as a whole, drawn largely from the letter to his editor, Milton Waldman, included in the second edition of the Silmarillion, sent in 1951. But we must, of course, begin at the beginning, and the beginning is a little difficult to pin down. For some, the beginning is September the 24th, 1914. A 22-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien, a senior at Oxford University, still an undergrad, is vacationing at his aunt's farm in Nottinghamshire. The continent has been deeply embroiled in war for 3 months now, and his family is urging him to enlist. But Tolkien wants to hold off on that until he has finished his studies, until he has graduated. It is during this brief vacation that he writes a short piece entitled The Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star. This, most scholars will tell you, is the beginning of the Legendarium, and I want to share here with you just the final stanza here. This is stanza 6 of The Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star. Then he glimmering passed to the starless vast as an eyelid lamp at sea, and beyond the ken of mortal man set his lonely errantry, tracking the sun in his galleon through the pathless firmament, till his light grew old in abysses cold, and his eager flame was spent. And I'll tell you, there's a little shiver running up my spine right now at just getting to read Tolkien poetry here on the internet again. But we mustn't fall into a trap. Certainly the name Eärendil here is very suggestive, but you'll note that EL ending. This is not Eärendil in the Quenya. This is Eärendil, the Old English word meaning growing or rising light. Though there's obviously a great deal of commonality here, this is not yet the character that Bilbo will describe in his poem at Rivendell, the Song of Eärendil, the song that begins, Eärendil was a mariner who tarried in Avernian, right? This is not yet that character, and for what it's worth, Tolkien himself also didn't credit this poem with beginning the Legendarium. He gives the credit to a piece that he writes the following year, The Shores of Faery, written in July of 1915, 3 months after he has enlisted with the Lancashire Fusiliers after graduating from Oxford. So this is the first 12 lines of The Shores of Faery, from which, of course, we draw the title of tonight's episode of Stars and Swords. East of the moon, west of the sun, there stands a lonely hill. Its feet are in the pale green sea, its towers are white and still, beyond Taniquetil and Valinor. Comes never there but one lone star that fled before the moon, that there the 2 trees naked are, that bore night's silver bloom and bore the globed fruit of noon in Valinor. Now, if there's some ambiguity about the Voyage of Eärendil, there's really no ambiguity here at all, because we're getting proper nouns for days. We're getting Taniquetil, we're getting Valinor, we're getting the 2 trees, we're getting the silver and the gold too. This is going to become very familiar to us by the time that we are done with this unit on the Silmarillion. The point of all of this, though, is fairly straightforward. In 1914 or 1915, Tolkien begins this creative project, the creative project which will occupy him for the next 50 plus years. It is 15 years after this that he sets down first the opening line of The Hobbit, right? He's in the middle of grading papers, famously. Everybody who's a fan of Tolkien knows this story, but he's grading papers, he's marking papers, and he comes across an empty sheet of paper, and in a moment of inspiration simply writes out, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And an entire, mythical world sprang into life, but not completely, not ex nihilo, right? It emerges from this creative impulse that began more than a decade before. Originally, in fact, The Hobbit is not a part of the Legendarium. The Hobbit is specifically not enfolded in this mythopoetic endeavor to which Tolkien has set himself. It's supposed to be a standalone story, but this mythology is rapacious. It is colonizing. It manages to slip its tendrils into The Hobbit and turn The Hobbit in time into a part of itself. So he would continue throughout his career to return to these stories. He would find different approaches and different inflections, different themes, different connections to the rest of his work. Far more often than not, he would abandon these drafts in an incomplete state long before they were done and embark on something new. This is the mythopoetic inclination of Professor Tolkien. This is the crafting of a coherent and to some extent comprehensive mythology of the Elder Days, and not, of course, just any old Elder Days, not the Elder Days of some made-up fantasy land, but rather the ancient days of Tolkien's own England. More on that in just a little while. Of course, he doesn't just create stories. He doesn't just create myths. The mythopoetic impulse is combined, of course, with the glossopoetic impulse, his fondness, his secret vice, per the title of his 1931 book, for creating constructed languages. Tolkien was, by training, a philologist, an expert on language and the mechanics of language itself, with a particular focus on Old English and the Germanic language cluster. But long before he attended Oxford, he was already making up languages as a hobby. Later in his life, he would claim that the mythopoetic impulse, the desire to tell stories, was actually an extension of the glossopoetic impulse, that all of the stories were created as a setting in which his constructed languages could exist. And I don't want to accuse the late professor of leaning into self-mythology a little bit there, but there's actually little evidence here in the beginning of his career. Certainly, as we just saw from the shores of Faery, there's no suggestion there that this is being constructed in order to provide a stage for a constructed language. It seems to be a story all on its own. These two things will become enfolded, of course. And the fact that there's no specific application for this first story, or for a handful of the first stories, really, doesn't mean that the impulse wasn't beneath the surface. It doesn't mean that Tolkien wasn't either subconsciously or unconsciously or just very quietly trying to provide exactly the kind of fictional setting for his constructed languages that he claimed to be. And this, even here, I'm aware, even as we move through what was supposed to be a breezy and accessible introduction to the Silmarillion, that I'm asterisking a lot. There's a lot here that I want to kind of to handle with care, that I don't want to be definitive. I don't want to be too declarative, because the truth is that there's an enormous amount of work here. There's an enormous complexity to that work. One of the perils of Tolkien scholarship is that every layer is underpinned by more layers. Every time you think that you've got an answer, it turns out that there are 4 more answers, and some of them contradict each other. There's always this series of alternate explanations, and this is true, I think, of all great literature, to some extent. But it's compounded in the particular case of Tolkien because of his original intention with these stories, right? Using stories there in the broadest possible sense, enfolding his myths, his songs, his poems, the entire corpus of work, the entire legendarium, right? These aren't single, standalone, created works. They are fragments and revisions situated in this long mythopoetic process that was not begun, right, even within its own frame, not begun by Tolkien himself, but rather by generations of historians before him. So even as he is creating this work, there's an aspect of revisionism. There's an aspect of interacting with texts and paratexts, some of which are known to us and some of which are not. To kind of frame this out and to illustrate why the path that we are going to take through the Silmarillion is so essential, I want to talk just a little about the history of the sagas of Middle-earth, of the entire legendarium here, the publication history specifically. So it's pretty straightforward, right? There's really not a lot that we have to delve into here. In 1937, The Hobbit. 54 is The Fellowship of the Ring. 54 is also The Two Towers. The end of 54 is The Two Towers. And then 55 is The Return of the King. And that's it, right? That's all. Well, no. Okay, that's not the whole thing. There are two more. 1962, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and Other Verses from the Red Book. And in 1967, The Road Goes Ever On, produced with Donald Swann, which is fantastic. Donald Swann was one half of the British comic musical duo Flanders and Swan, whose most famous hit, I suppose, is probably The Hippopotamus. It's the song that goes "Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud." You may be familiar with that. If you're British, you're definitely familiar with that. So that was created by Flanders and Swan. Donald Swann would then later go on to create The Road Goes Ever On with Professor Tolkien, which is a collection of songs which are intended to be listened to as a cycle, that you're supposed to progress through the poems and songs, most of which are taken from The Lord of the Rings. I think there was only one original song, in fact, in that collection. Similarly, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and Other Verses from the Red Book is mostly, again, poems taken from The Lord of the Rings, including, interestingly, Errantry, the original version of the poem about Eärendil, which I mentioned earlier, right? There's originally an entirely different version of that poem in the manuscript for The Lord of the Rings, which obviously ties back to the version of Eärendil that we just saw. So these are very much ancillary works. These are reframings of the poetic inclination, which also is so evident in Tolkien's work. Professor Tolkien, sadly, dies on September the 2nd, 1973, at the ripe old age of 81, 2 years after his beloved Edith, more on whom later. And so we move into the presumably very brief posthumous publication of his work, beginning with a weird curiosity, actually, beginning with Bilbo's last song here in 1974. This is a 24-line poem, said to be composed, appropriately enough, by Bilbo Baggins at the very end of his long life. It was originally published in Dutch as a limited edition series of posters, was then printed in the US with different art. But the definitive version is the 1974 Allen and Unwin British version with art by Pauline Baynes, who is, of course, I'll call this slide up here so you can see it. Pauline Baynes, of course, well known for providing the illustrations for C.S. Lewis's Narniad series, right? If you've missed out on Prince Caspian, we're using Narniad now. Narniad is cool. That's what we're doing over there. I suggest you go back and listen to the Prince Caspian series that I produced over Christmas. From there, and also, obviously, how beautiful is this art? How stunning is this art? From there, though, things really kick off because of Christopher Tolkien, the professor's youngest son, the third of four siblings, who undertakes the task of rounding out his father's legacy by publishing the supporting material from the many stories of Middle-earth, working alongside a Canadian philosophy student named Guy Kay, who would later go on to produce some fantasy novels all his own, which I've always wanted to like more than I do. There are some really interesting ideas in the work of Guy Kay. Actually, now that I think of it, Guy Kay could be a really interesting subject for a bonus episode as we move through this series. I'm going to try as much as possible in our monthly bonus episodes here on Stars and Swords to pull away from Tolkien, to pull away from fantasy as a genre, but it might be really interesting to look at the first of Guy Kay's portal fantasy novels, right, which weirdly has more in common with C.S. Lewis's Narniad than it does with the works of Professor Tolkien himself. So this is a collaborative, largely academic, partially creative work. It's by no means as comprehensive as the work which Christopher will later produce, though, of course, there aren't any later books because the Silmarillion is the last word, and that's just not true. Oh, I wanted to pull this slide, in fact, from the first edition of the Silmarillion, right, which outlines, I think, Christopher Tolkien's motivation for preparing this volume. So this is from the original foreword to the Silmarillion, quote, "On my father's death, it fell to me to try to bring the work into a publishable form. It became clear to me that to attempt to present within the covers of a single book the diversity of the materials, to show the Silmarillion as in truth a continuing and evolving creation extending over more than half a century, would in fact lead only to confusion and the submerging of what is essential. I set myself therefore to work out a single text, selecting and arranging in such a way as it seemed to me to produce the most coherent and internally self-consistent narrative. In this work, the concluding chapters from the death of Turin Turambar introduced peculiar difficulties in that they had remained unchanged for many years and were in some respects in serious disharmony with more developed conceptions in other parts of the book," which gives us a sense of the challenge that Christopher Tolkien had, and I say this every time I have the opportunity to do so, Christopher Tolkien is under-respected and under-heralded as an academic mind. The work that he has done on his father's legacy, I think, is really without peer or parallel. It's a really phenomenal academic undertaking that is honestly rivaling any academic undertaking in this field. I can't think of someone who has so fully and comprehensively assembled such a challenging and overwhelming body of work and made it not just comprehensible, made it not just accessible to the layperson, never mind the academic mind, but has found within it such additional joy and such additional illumination of the underlying ideas. I cannot commend Christopher Tolkien's work enough. But here we see, from this forward to the first edition, exactly the challenge with which he was faced and his solution to it. Well, there's too much. I can't possibly publish everything my father had to say, so I'm going to compile a relatively slender volume, particularly compared to The Lord of the Rings itself, a relatively slender volume that is going to give a comprehensive sense of what the backstory for The Lord of the Rings was. And in so doing, he has been, I think, roundly successful. But this isn't, of course, the end of the story. These are the other books that have been published in the wake of the professor's death. Because after the Silmarillion, which is a success, Christopher Tolkien looks around and finds other stories, other fragments. Now, they're not as complete, and maybe they don't sit as cohesively together, though, as he notes, the end of the Silmarillion also is not completely cohesive with later versions of earlier stories as written by the professor. So after the Silmarillion, in 1980, we get Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, just a collection of other stories. We then get, in 83, the Book of Lost Tales 1, which is supposed to be an effort to really round it out. This is everything. This is all of it. The Book of Lost Tales 2 follows in 1984, and that is the end. Except for, in 1985, The Lays of Beleriand, and in 1986, The Shaping of Middle-earth, and in 1987, The Lost Road and Other Writings, in 88, The Return of the Shadow, in 89, The Treason of Isengard, in 1990, The War of the Ring, in 1992, Sauron Defeated, in 1993, Morgoth's Ring, in 94, The War of the Jewels, and in 96, The Peoples of Middle-earth. Taken in their entirety, this 12-volume series, The History of Middle-earth, is damn near a collection of every single thing that Tolkien ever wrote in his Legendarium, arrayed in a kind of chronological order that allows you to see the revisions happening to the texts. Everything from, where are we here? Everything from The Return of the Shadow to Sauron Defeated is the history of Lord of the Rings, and then The War of the Jewels, I guess Morgoth's Ring and The War of the Jewels is the history of the Silmarillion, the further publication there. They are phenomenally comprehensive. They are also awesome. They are really accessible. Now, you need to be something approaching a Tolkien superfan to delve into these. You have to be really interested not just in the stories as they fall out of the Legendarium, but in the shaping of the stories themselves, in all the material that's also been discarded. But at least with the publication of The Peoples of Middle-earth in 1996, we can finally say that the publication history of Professor Tolkien's Legendarium is done. I'm just kidding. Because we also have a flurry of further books. In 2007, The Children of Húrin. Also in 2007, The History of the Hobbit, written by John Ratliff. That volume was kind of conceived as another volume of the history of Middle-earth, but Christopher Tolkien didn't want to undertake that process himself, so it was passed to a young man named Tom Santosky, a student of Tolkien's Elven languages in particular, who had assisted with the preparation of the history of Middle-earth up to that point. But unfortunately, Santosky died in 1991 at a very early age, and the job was then taken up by Ratliff, who, in addition to a body of respected academic work, is also kind of, a venerated saint in this house because he co-wrote and co-edited the 3rd edition rules for Dungeons & Dragons. So that's the history of The Hobbit in 2007. Then we get a decade break, and we get the final preparation of the final works, right? These are really the final volumes that Christopher Tolkien would put together during his life, too. In 2017, Beren and Luthien. In 2018, The Fall of Gondolin. In 2021, we get The Nature of Middle-earth, edited by Karl Hostetter, which is a collection of essays written by Tolkien during his life where he gives very factual accounts of the calendar and the geography and the demographics and like very specific technical detail about the workings of Middle-earth and all its many peoples. In 2022, we get The Fall of Numenor from Brian Sibley, which was unfortunately the first posthumous volume after the death of Christopher Tolkien too. It was released alongside the Amazon series The Rings of Power, the first season thereof, and it is not particularly well regarded. And I say this without having read the book myself, but having gleaned the critical response to this book, that it is perhaps a little less well developed and a little less comprehensive, that it's lacking some of that critical power that we saw in the earlier volumes. If you have read it, by the way, and feel differently, then please do get in touch and let me know. And then in 2024, we get the colossal collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Christina Scull and Wayne G. Hammond, who also previously have produced the Lord of the Rings companion, the annotated companion to the Lord of the Rings, which is a great and very important volume, which you can also see here on the shelf behind me. So all of this shows us how deeply the legendarium has been explored, how fully it has been analyzed, how carefully and painstakingly we have pulled it apart, and then in this latter era kind of put it all back together again, because we're seeing some of that creative impulse here with the latter series of books. I want to switch out here, in fact, to frame out the next part of our conversation. Again, one of the other challenges of discussing the Silmarillion is really putting into order the things that we ought to say. Let us establish this. Let us assert this to be true at this point in the proceedings. To try to completely and comprehensively annotate the Silmarillion would be impossible. It would be a fool's errand. It would be the longest podcast in history. I know that some people have undertaken it. I know that the venerated Professor Corey Olsen has undertaken exactly that kind of approach previously in the past, and that I think is an absolutely admirable endeavor. But the problem with trying to treat the Silmarillion as though it is a roadmap to the rest of the Legendarium, to the history of the Middle-earth, or to fully explore every detail through the prism of the history of Middle-earth, is to lose sight, I think, of what makes the Silmarillion particularly and specifically special as a bound volume, as the first response by Christopher Tolkien to his father's published work and to his father's, enormous and incalculably valuable creative output. It is a specific volume, and the choices that he makes in the preparation of this volume are also, I think, revealing, though, as ever, we're not going to take a completely biographical approach here. We're not going to really spend a lot of time thinking about why or why not Christopher Tolkien did or did not make particular decisions. We're going to look at the book as a mythology, as a history, as a collection of stories from very specific perspectives to very specific purpose. I want to pull here another note here from the first edition of the Silmarillion, from the foreword here. So this is Christopher Tolkien writing in 1977. Quote, "The Silmarillion is indeed the central stock of that great imaginative enterprise from which the Lord of the Rings was derived. For the elves were there from its beginning, and in them are to be discerned some of the primary aesthetic and philosophical convictions of the author." End quote. And that is what we are going to pursue. That is the reason for reading the Silmarillion. Honestly, I think that besides the richness of the mythology, besides the yes, all of the depth, all of the complexity, all of the fantastic imaginative work done by Professor Tolkien in its creation and done by Christopher Tolkien in its compilation, the real purpose of the Silmarillion is to give us another insight on the Lord of the Rings and its broader setting, right? On what Professor Tolkien thought was important, the primary aesthetic and philosophical convictions of the author. I want to look at this book in the way that we look at real mythology, in the way that we seek to understand ourselves through our history. What is being communicated here? Not what is 4 footnotes deep, buried in the 4th volume of the History of Middle-earth. And I randomly picked the 4th volume of the History of Middle-earth, but I actually have it within, here, if I lean out of shot for just a moment, within arm's reach right now. But that's besides the point, right? What really matters is the aesthetic and philosophical inclination, the aesthetic and philosophical desire of the Silmarillion as a volume of collected work. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look closely at this text to get a better sense of the big picture, right? The mythology of Middle-earth is conceived as a means of exploring exactly these aesthetic regimes, these philosophical regimes, the theological, the moral, the cosmological landscape of the world as Tolkien understands it. And if that's true, and it is, then let's look at it from that perspective. This is not, as I say, the only viable reading strategy for the Silmarillion. It's also entirely possible to read this with a sheaf of post-it notes attached, trying to figure out every possible connection, trying to figure out exactly where in the creative morass of Tolkien's life, the creative maelstrom is perhaps a better word, of Tolkien's life, each fragment of this text first existed. You can absolutely do that. You can also painstakingly try to figure out exactly what was created by Christopher Tolkien himself, which passages here were written anew so that they could be stitched into existing work and thereby create this cohesive whole, this semi-cohesive whole, honestly. That is an appropriate reading strategy too, but it's not the reading strategy that we are going to take right here. We're not going to treat this as a collection of puzzles to be solved, but rather as a gateway into this deeper and richer world. And in that spirit, let's take a look at the narrative itself. Let's take a look in the form of this abridged and abbreviated accounting of the Silmarillion. I'm realizing that this was supposed to be a 20-minute introductory lecture, and I'm already at 25 minutes, and I still want to talk about a lot of things. C'est la vie, such as this ongoing project here. I want to talk about the letter to Tolkien's editor here in 1951, presented as a part of the introductory matter, the prefatory matter to the second edition of the Silmarillion, right? So Christopher Tolkien himself has published the Silmarillion originally and has received a kind of feedback and has had some second thoughts about his own preparation of that novel, of that volume, I should say. In part, he has some regrets about letting go the ongoing framing device, the frame story that Tolkien uses consistently through his life. And I don't want to spend too much time on that because it is notably absent from this volume as we read it today. But there is, as I suggested earlier, within Tolkien's mythopoetic creation, the idea of a chain, a documentary chain leading from eldest antiquity through the elves, through the hobbits, to the hands of man, all the way to Tolkien himself, right? He positions himself as a translator of this much older text rather than an originating creative voice. The idea of being an adapter, of being a secondary creative unit, of course, is absolutely in accord with Tolkien's theological beliefs about the roots of creativity. More on that as we move into our discussion of the Ainulindalë next week. But I did want to start by just shining a light on some very brief excerpts from this in-depth letter that Tolkien writes, basically sketching the whole of the story. And I don't want to move through it too carefully here in this introductory episode, precisely because he sketches the entire story, right? Precisely because he gives us the capsule version of the entirety of the Silmarillion. And that's not going to be as helpful as we would want it to be when we move into the discussion of the text itself. But we are going to be referring back to Tolkien's perspective on these stories as we move through the book as a whole. But I want to begin with the beginning, I guess, of this letter here. Quote, "My dear Milton, you asked for a brief sketch of my stuff that is connected with my imaginary world. It is difficult to say anything without saying too much. The attempt to say a few words opens a floodgate of excitement. The egoist and artist at once desires to say how the stuff has grown, what it is like, and what he thinks he means or is trying to represent by it all. I shall inflict some of this on you, and I will append a mere resume of its contents, which is, maybe, all that you want or will have use or time for." If you've never read Professor Tolkien's letters, which you should, the bound volume of his letters is freely available and is, not freely available, is readily available, is frequently available, but it is absolutely charming because his voice is so unfiltered and so rich and complex and internally contradictory in a way that I find absolutely charming. He writes with an enormous assurance and self-awareness at the same time, which is just so rewarding. I think in addition to being, my favorite writer, right? In addition to being one of the greatest literary minds, in addition to being the author of the richest act of secondary creation, right? To give his theological perspective due respect there. The greatest writer in the English language, the most complex and thoughtful writer in the English language. He is also one of the warmest and most engaging letter writers that it's ever been my pleasure to encounter, and I recommend that volume very highly. And we see all of that here, I think, right? You asked for a brief sketch of myself that's connected with my imaginary world, and it's difficult to say anything without saying too much. Spoilers, he's then going to proceed to say an awful lot, right? This mere resume of its contents lasts for pages and pages and pages and pages, and is brilliant, but is still extremely long. You'll note, too, dedicated Tolkien reader that you are, the little paren there on, what is that, the fourth line of that paragraph, and what he thinks he means or is trying to represent by it all. I think Tolkien specifically takes arms against allegory twice in the course of this one single letter. So it may even be more than that for all that I remember. But yeah, certainly at least twice. So this is to introduce, right, this letter, this accounting. But before he gets to the story of Middle-earth, he gives an accounting of why this story is necessary, of where this creative impulse comes from. And again, we have to remember that this is being written in 1951, right? So we are already 35 years separated from the originary maneuver, the beginning of Middle-earth as Tolkien understood and created it. So there is, to some extent, perhaps a certain amount of self-mythologizing here, right? There's a certain amount of, having thought about this for more than 3 decades, he kind of has arrived at an understanding of his own creative process, which maybe isn't completely consistent with the first steps down that road, but which nonetheless is reflective of a mature and self-aware approach to his own material. And this is why, of course, he writes it. Quote, "I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought, and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. There was Greek and Celtic and Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian and Finnish, which greatly affected me, but nothing English, save impoverished chapbook stuff. Of course, there was and is all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain, but not with English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. For one thing, its Faery is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary, real world. I am speaking, of course, of our present situation, not of ancient pagan pre-Christian days, and I will not repeat what I tried to say in my essay, which you read. The essay to which Tolkien refers here, of course, is On Fairy Stories, published in 1947, adapted from a lecture that he gave at St. Andrews University in 1939, and probably, no, I think I can in this one instance, maybe be declarative. I can maybe be declarative. Have you ever heard a man hedge so much? I will be declarative. On Fairy Stories is the most important academic piece of writing that Tolkien produced during his life. It is a phenomenal piece of work and betrays a profound understanding of what fairy stories are for, which Tolkien is kind of getting at in this excerpt too, right? Tolkien was a Christian. All of his works are steeped in a kind of Christian morality, but he doesn't want to co-opt the Arthurian tradition because it is consciously created in a milieu of Christian thought and Christian principle. He understands that the older stories have contained within them the same truth, right? This is still a Christian world. The eldest days of Middle-earth are still, in a sense, a Christian world, but that we ought not to use Christianity, right? We ought not to use this separate mythology as an allegorical functioning mechanism to reach the deeper truth, or vice versa. And you can see, if you've never read Tolkien's thoughts on the Narniad, on C.S. Lewis's work, you can see here, I think, enough of Tolkien's perspective that you would be able to predict correctly his opinion of the Narniad as it was created. Of course, he's writing this in 1951, right at the publication of Narnia 2. So he's clear in his intent, right? There ought to be a mythological structure, a mythological system, a cycle of mythopoetic work which applies and can be drawn upon by England, right? This unique and complex and challenging nation deserves these deep mythopoetic roots because, crucially, right, this is important, everybody deserves them, right? He doesn't devalue the Greek, the Celtic, the Romantic, the Germanic, the Scandinavian, the Finnish. He's not devaluing those. He's saying, I wish we had those. I wish that they apply to us as powerfully as they apply to their own nation states, right? There's no sense that well, okay, let's be careful here, right? There is a sense in which England is special. There is a sense in which England is unique, but it is special and it is unique in the way that every nation is special and unique. There's no, I think, degradation of other mythic cultures or of other mythic traditions in Tolkien's desire to create, to almost discover something that is true of England too, and not just true of England as a geographical entity, right? As not even as a kingdom, as a culture, but as a language. That's, of course, where he's going to land first in his desire to create this legendarium. I want to move, and again, all of this, of course, is going to inform our approach to the Silmarillion as we're looking at it. What does this tell us of England, right? In the best and most virtuous sense. What does this tell us of Tolkien's view of the world? Yes, but of his part of the world specifically. Let's move forward here, because the other thing that we have to talk about as we're moving through the Silmarillion, we have to pay very close attention to the origins of each part of this story, which are, to a greater or lesser extent, laid out for us. But we have to bear them in mind, that there is no single author of the Silmarillion within the text itself. In effect, the Silmarillion is a bound anthology of mutual paratexts, right, that come from different places, compiled by different authors to, crucially, different purposes. This is from a little later in the letter here. Quote, as I say, the legendary Silmarillion is peculiar and differs from all similar things that I know in not being anthropocentric. Its center of view and interest is not men, but elves. Men come in inevitably. After all, the author is a man, and if he has an audience, they will be men, and men must come into our tales as such, and not merely transfigured or partially represented as elves, dwarves, hobbits, etc. But they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, not principals. One of the things which I find so fascinating about this letter and about his description of the actual Silmarillion is his refusal to account for the initial fall of man, his actual steadfast refusal to get into the fall of man, which he acknowledges for the elves is so important. You know what, we'll talk about all of that in due course when we can apply it to the actual stories that we are reading. So, what sets the Silmarillion apart? Well, it's not about man. It's not primarily about man. The author, you'll note, is a man, which is a beautifully ambiguous statement. If you fold in Tolkien's frame story here, right, does he mean that he, the author of this story, is a man? Or does he mean that the Anglo-Saxon traveler who compiles these elvish stories and carries them back to England is indeed the original author? It's as with everything, just phenomenally rich here. If the author is a man and if he has an audience, they will be men, and men must come into our tales as such. But this is the important part. Not merely transfigured or partially represented as elves, dwarves, hobbits, etc. There is a long-standing tradition in speculative fiction, in both wings of speculative fiction, in all three wings of speculative fiction. I don't know why I have to do horror stories so dirty as to exclude them from this particular metaphor. In all parts of speculative fiction, there is a long-standing tradition that if something is inhuman, it is really an extension of what a human is in one particular aspect, right? If we look at the go-to example, if we look at Star Trek, all of the aliens in Star Trek are facets of the human soul, the human spirit, the human emotional palette, right? The Vulcans are our logic, and the Klingons are our aggression, and the Borg are communists, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? The Cardassians and the Romulans represent our treachery, and the Bajorans represent our mysticism and like hippie culture. That is a long-standing tradition in speculative fiction, and it was to some extent a tradition long before Tolkien started writing. You know, you can go back to to Swift, to Gulliver's Travels. Is that maybe like the originating impulse of this kind of fragmenting of the soul of man, right? Capital M, man. It's hard to escape that particular gender term when you're talking about Tolkien, but I'll try my best to render this as humans as often as I can, right? But it's this is a very old and even by the time that Tolkien is writing, kind of exhausted approach to speculative fiction, to secondary creation, to the population, the peopling of an imaginary world with individuals who are not themselves humans. But this is crucial. Elves are not just a kind of man with some parts excised and some parts emphasized. Neither are hobbits, neither are dwarves. They are full and rich in their own representation on the page, and that is a thing that we must continue to acknowledge. This is a thing that is very important to him, as is made clear in this letter. So we must always be aware of voice, of perspective, and of identity, and we mustn't collapse the Silmarillion into a kind of stage show put on by human beings for the benefit of human beings, if you see what I mean. More on that, of course, when we get to the Ainulindalë next week, because paying attention to what is literally represented in the Silmarillion and what is metaphorically represented in the Silmarillion unlocks an enormous interpretive space. I think that understanding what is historical and what is mythological, right? Those two wings of Tolkien's creative impulse here, understanding which is which you can do by paying close attention to the text, really does, I think, unlock a lot of analytical potential and yields us a great deal of insight into the underpinnings of the work here. This, I think, will be our last slide, as I have now gone on, yes, twice as long as I intended. Here we are. And I wanted to pull this really just to talk again about the warmth of Tolkien as a letter writer, primarily, because this is just adorable. This is from the very end of the letter, which, crucially, Christopher Tolkien does not include in that prefatory material to the second edition of the Silmarillion, right? You have to go and look up the letters of Tolkien in the bound volume in order to find the very end of this. And I love this as a pitch to his editor. This is so brilliant as a strategy for getting the Silmarillion published. That, of course, is his reason for writing to his editor at this point, is to try and encourage him to publish alongside The Lord of the Rings, which is now guaranteed to be a hit, because people have been waiting since, the publication of The Hobbit for this expanded sequel. He really wants some of the Silmarillion, what will become the Silmarillion, to appear on bookstore shelves alongside The Lord of the Rings, and this is part of his strategy. Quote, "A slight revision, now accomplished, to a crucial point in The Hobbit, clarifying the character of Gollum and his relation to the ring, will enable me to reduce Book 1, Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past, simplify it and quicken it, and also simplify the debatable opening of Book 2 a little. If the other material, the Silmarillion, and in some other tales or links, such as the downfall of Numenor, are published or in process of this, then much explanation of background, and especially that found in the Council of Elrond, Book 2, could be dispensed with. But altogether, it would hardly amount to excision of a single long chapter out of about 72. I wonder if, even if legible, you will ever read this." What a brilliant moment, again, of that gorgeous self-awareness there right at the end. I have just written 10,000 words that is borderline impenetrable. But I wonder if you'll read it. I wonder if you'll get to it. But this argument, right, the slight revision now accomplished to the crucial point in The Hobbit, clarifying the character of Gollum and his relationship to the ring. Basically, he's talking about the revision to the second edition of The Hobbit, which is basically oriented around the alterations to Chapter 5, to Riddles in the Dark, right? He changes the character of Gollum by changing Bilbo's accounting of his encounter with Gollum, right? Again, kind of folding in this revisionist tendency. It's not just rewritten, it's not just changed. There's actually a deeper story beneath the story that you read originally in the first edition of The Hobbit. But this argument, if you would publish the Silmarillion, if you would publish some of these older stories, right, some other tales or links such as the downfall of Numenor, if they are published or if they're in the process of being published, then, I could probably make the beginning of Book 2 much more readable. I could probably make the Council of Elrond, that chapter that makes people who don't like The Lord of the Rings stop reading The Lord of the Rings, I could probably make that flow a little more easily. This tells us two things. It tells us that Tolkien was not writing by accident. It tells us that everything that he was including was included with purpose, with intentionality. It was, at least to his mind, absolutely necessary if we were to understand the rest of the story. He was aware of the fact that the Council of Elrond is kind of a heavy read, right? The first time you hit it, particularly if you're a younger reader, or you're a reader who has just read The Hobbit, or perhaps you've been a fan of The Hobbit for 20 long years and now you're frantically waiting for the sequel, right? If you are someone who's coming in expecting more adventures of Hobbit folk, then the Council of Elrond is an uphill climb. Now, the Council of Elrond is, let me say, fantastic. But I'll admit that I maybe bounced off it my first time through The Lord of the Rings, and I know many people, brilliant, insightful, wonderful, very literate people, who have similarly bounced off of it too. So Tolkien is aware that it's challenging, but he does not think that that means that it ought to be simplified, right? So we have this specific application of Tolkien's creative intent and his own consistency with his own work. You need to have this information, so I'm going to give you this information either in the Council of Elrond, which is going to be an ask, or in an attendant volume, which you'll also probably have to read if you're really going to understand what's happening in The Lord of the Rings. So he understands all of that, but he's unwilling to simplify it. And that, I've talked around this a couple of times, even just this evening, right? Because we do think, of course, of Professor Tolkien as the author of the Legendarium, right? He is the creative spirit. He's the creative spark behind all of this work and all these many revisions of stories. But he clearly thinks of himself as something of an archivist. And I know, and if you know anything about Tolkien, you're probably yelling this at your podcast app right now. Of course, this comes back to to Mythopoeia, right? It comes back to the way that he thinks creativity works, that there is one creative force in the universe, and that is God. And all creativity issues forth from God, but is reflected prismatically through the individual artist, right? He is not creating, he is subcreating. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the Ainulindalë next week, I promise. If you think I'm skimming over this or that this is an important part of the context here, don't worry, we will get to it. But it shows this deep commitment to the authenticity, right? To the in-universe authenticity of these texts and how important and significant that is, both in the expression of the story, both as a narrative unit, but also as a part of his own understanding, his own comprehension of the world that he himself has created. He is in a constant state of interrogation with his own work and will remain so, especially, I think, as we move through the Silmarillion here. And that really gets us to my final point, which is to return to how we are going to read the Silmarillion, because the narrative strategies employed by Tolkien are unlike the narrative strategies of basically any other writer that you can think of, because, as I mentioned in the past, in a sense, Tolkien is not an author. He's not certainly a novelist in the traditional definition, right? He's not sitting down and trying to compose a story to entertain primarily the reader. He's trying to do something much more ambitious. He's trying to do something much more complex, and he's trying through his creative work to approach a kind of truth. In that way, he functions much more as an historian than as a novelist or as someone engaged in the act of free and creative writing. There is always the sense that when he is revising, when he is giving up on these certain drafts of text, right, when he's abandoning Luthien for the 14th time, having progressed so far through the story, he just will give it up, and will return to it again at some point in the future, but gives it up as a bad job, right? It's not quite right. Yet there is a sense that he is trying to uncover something that is true. And therefore, as we progress through the Silmarillion, I want to be mindful of that desire. I want to be mindful of that interpretive mode, right, that matches that creative mode. I want to some extent, read this as mythology, read this as history, and see what falls out as we make those interpretive moves, rather than making the kinds of interpretive moves that we would make if we were reading just a straightforward novel, albeit a novel with a confused premise and a challenging set of perspectives and protagonists that we have to wrestle with, right? We're not going to read this the way that one would read Infinite Jest. We're not going to read this the way that one would read Middlemarch. We're going to look at this as something broadly unique, particularly unique in this mode, I think. And all of this is just to set up the broadest possible and most inclusive and positive and joyous reading experience that we can possibly have together over the course of the next, 20 weeks. It's probably going to last longer than 20. You can find the full schedule in the show notes. In fact, I have a slide here with just what we're expecting to do over the next few weeks. Here we are. January the 16th, live on next Thursday evening, probably 8 p.m. Central, though stay tuned. More on how to get access to the live broadcasts in just a moment. But next Thursday night, January the 16th, we are going to look at the Ainulindalë in its entirety. The Ainulindalë is short, right? Almost all of the Silmarillion is the Quenta Silmarillion, but these attendant books we're going to cover pretty quickly. So we're going to look at all of the Ainulindalë next week. The following week, January 23rd, we're going to look at the Vala Quenta. And then on January 30th, we're going to begin the damn thing, and we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2 of the Quenta Silmarillion. That means that covering the entire book will take us around 20 weeks. It's going to take us to the very end of June, in fact. And I'm expecting that schedule to slip a little bit. I'm expecting that schedule to be a little soft, but I really am going to try and be fairly rigorous, right? This is in the printed version of the book that I'm using, in addition to the digital version of the book I'm using and the audiobook version that I am using. The printed edition is like 300 pages. So we're looking at, what does that come out to? 13 to 14 pages a week. That's really not that much. And I think that we can hopefully maintain that rate as we go. We'll see, guys. It's going to fall apart. Of course it's going to fall apart, but is there not, in its way, a beauty in the falling apart? Does Tolkien not teach us that the fall is necessary? Not to, compare my humble podcast to the decline and fall of men or elves. That is going to do it, though. I have to stop right now before I go even further. That's going to do it for this abbreviated introductory episode of Stars and Swords. I hope that you will join me next Thursday evening for... Oh, I wanted to frame this out. Yes, to tell you exactly how to get access to that aforementioned live broadcast. Patreon.com/nextword. That is the place where you can throw a couple of dollars my way every month in order to support the endeavor here at Stars and Swords and the other podcasts produced by Next Word, which is currently just one other podcast. Don't You Know Me By Now? An in-depth, kind of freewheeling, semi-literary, semi-autobiographical look at the Before trilogy. Ethan Hawke, Julie Delpy, Richard Linklater, that Before trilogy. That's a ton of fun. We're almost at the end of the first movie, and it's been really good. We watched those films, in like 10-minute chunks so that we can really delve into the heart and get to what makes those movies so special. So you can find that links to that at nomepod.com. But more importantly, patreon.com/nextword. Pledge your support there to help me keep making podcasts. But if you cannot, for whatever reason, pledge your support there to help me keep making podcasts, just head on over there and follow the page anyway. And for free, I post the link every Thursday to that upcoming live session. So you can get in there and join me live as I'm moving through the pages of the Ainulindalë with like brisk and methodical strategies. Just really being concise, really focused, really on task. That is going to do it for this introductory episode of the Silmarillion unit here on Stars and Swords. Thank you all for your many notes of excitement and anticipation. I should mention, I think I've told everyone who has emailed me this personally already, but yes, the end of my previous Tolkien podcast project, There and Back Again, is coming. I do have what will probably be one gigantic final episode in the pipeline right now. I am working on it. I have actively, I have pulled slides. I am writing a script. I am getting ready to do that. So that will come along. That will help me finish out my study of The Lord of the Rings. You can find links to that too in the show notes to the whole body of There and Back Again. But I hope you will join me in this journey through the Silmarillion. I hope you will join me for our infrequent bonus episodes too, as we look at some other things. The first bonus episode coming up, if you're just to entice you to support me over on the Patreon page, thanks to the influence of the wonderful Leslie Skipa over on the Patreon Discord. Another benefit of supporting Next Word on Patreon is that you get access to a Discord where you can hang out with me from time to time. Thanks to Skipa's wonderful influence, we're going to pick a Harlequin romance. We're going to pick category romance, and we are going to take a look at that in one single session that will probably take place around the end of January. So I will release information about which book we're picking and how to get hold of it and all of that stuff. But category romance is such an interesting and specific genre in much the same way as the Silmarillion, right? You need entirely different interpretive strategies if you're going to look at category romance as literature, as you should. But it functions in ways which are unlike any other genre, and that is just fascinating. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to look at a really conventional kind of middle of the road, like mainstream mass market Harlequin romance. I think that's going to be a really interesting and enjoyable endeavor. So all of that too over patreon.com/nextword. I'm going to finish the show now, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. You can find out more, starsandswords.com. You can email me, starsandswordspod@gmail.com. You can find the YouTube links and all the other links over on the website, starsandswords.com. I will talk to you all again on Thursday. Until then, take care. Good night.